All right, Ed. So I myself would like to start off by saying thank you for joining the podcast. Tools of Titans is one of my favorite books of all time, and I've been on this journey for the past 4 years, trying to speak to one individual on this book, and you were the first person to give me the opportunity. So thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Yep. So, Ed, first thing that I saw that stuck out, right? It says you are Grandmaster of Memory. And for myself, this gave me Queen's Gambit vibes. I always thought that Grandmastery was for chess players, but it
hmm
turns there's other verticals that you could be a Grandmaster in. So, for yourself, Ed, what does this entail to be a Grandmaster of Memory, and how did you even get into this space?
So there's an interesting story, by the way. I think somehow involving the King of Luxembourg. The Royal Family of Luxembourg have some role in the official orchestration of chess grandmasterships. But anyhow, yeah, there's this annual memory tournament called the World Memory Championships, which is started by a guy called Tony Buzan. It's been running for the last 30 years. People who love memorizing things come to this tournament every year. And this is the kind of place where you get like measured for a grandmastership. And there are three in total in memory events. There's like 10 events in the World Memory Championships, but there are three events which grandmastership is measured on. You got to be able to remember a shuffled deck of cards in 2 minutes. You got to be able to remember, I think it's 1,000-digit number in an hour, and you got to be able to memorize 10 packs of cards in an hour. So these are that's how you become a grandmaster.
That's actually insane. So, like, how did you even understand that you had this ability to memorize things? Because like 1,000 numbers in a row seems impossible for mere mortals like myself.
Yeah, well, it would be impossible for me without technique. I mean, I
Right.
do have a disposition. I do quite enjoy the feeling
Hmm.
of grokking things, of that kind of sensation of stuff sticking in the mind is something which I guess I've always taken pleasure from. But what happened was that I was when I was 18 years old, I had this obscure disease called post-viral arthritis, which is, in a manner of speaking, is when you have a virus in your body, and then
Hmm.
afterwards it basically attacks your joints because it thinks, or your immune system attacks your own joints because they think it's the virus. Anyway, it all passed and I'm fine now, but it basically meant I was in hospital for 3 months, aged 18.
Oh,
And so I had really nothing to do. And I really had nothing to do. I mean, it is quite boring. It was an arthritis ward as well. So I was surrounded by all these like octogenarians having the same conversations.
right.
And a friend of mine bought me a book by the then 8 times world memory champion Dominic O'Brien and said, well, why don't you learn to remember stuff? And it turns out that, to my great surprise, memory techniques are incredibly natural and engaging and fun. It's all about using your imagination to transform information into a form that is more vivid and memorable and understandable than just the natural form of the information. And so, so I'd learned these techniques, which also include, repetition and
Yeah.
um, certain forms of active testing, and importantly, the use of the memory palace, which I can get onto in a second. And what's interesting is that within a very short amount of time, 2, 3 months, I was able to memorize a deck of cards, to learn a 1,000-digit number of these things. And it's not because of some occult mental ability. It really is a set of techniques for how to move your mind.
Right. Yeah. Because I think for the most part, everyone's gonna look at you and think you're like a superhuman. This guy is just
Yeah, I
memorizing it.
mean, it does it does present very well. I mean, occasionally I'm with friends. It happened the other night. I was at dinner with a guy in London who was like, "Ed, can you do the memory trick?" And I'm like, "Really?" Yeah, I do it. And I was like, "Oh wow!"
Yeah.
And it's funny because even after you explain how it's done, and in fact, even after you teach people how to do it, people are still mind blown because it feels so different when you're doing it yourself. Because actually, 2 minutes is quite a long time.
Hmm.
Like a second is like one, two, three. There's quite a lot can happen in a second. You
Right.
can see like three images in a second. You can have two thoughts, and so actually, it's not as fast as it looks, but it just looks so difficult when you're looking at someone remembering a pack of cards that your kind of brain turns off and you're just like, "What?"
Yeah, for sure. And going back to that first piece, right? Like you said, you really honed in on this when you were in the hospital for 3 months and
Mhm.
you were just like bored. There's this thing that I've been doing more research on in terms of like fasting for the mind, in terms of stillness.
Mhm.
Maybe 100 years ago, people didn't have obviously a phone, they weren't scrolling on social media, and they were really in their own mind a lot more. And for myself, even now with like AI. I feel like my critical thinking is going down slightly because I'm always constantly going towards AI to ask any question now.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
feel like a certain dependence with artificial intelligence, or kind of what's your take on that?
I think it's a very real phenomenon, the
Mm,
outsourcing of cognition.
right.
And I like to remember, like, I think that the history of media and the history of technology has, in some ways, been the history of outsourcing more and more of our cognition to the environment. And
Mhm,
generally speaking, I'm a fan of like the extended mind hypothesis, which doesn't identify the mind too much with the brain, but says, okay, actually, if I'm doing mathematical calculation, I'm using this piece of paper, I'm using this pen, I'm expanding my memory and my ability to structure ideas. I'm using external signs in order to be able to have thoughts. So it's a very normal thing for us to use external things to extend our thought. And books do this.
right.
But I like to remember the moment where there's this moment in Plato writes it up, but where Socrates is basically bemoaning the invention of the book, and the quote's amazing. It's like along the lines of, your students will be able to masquerade as having understanding when in fact they understand nothing, and they will seem to be wise, but in fact they've got no experience, etc. And he was worried even then at the beginning of the book that the book would be a means by which people could seem both to themselves and to the world like they have knowledge or understanding, but actually not having the depth of thought and insight that the genuine understanding or the lived experience can bring. Anyway, so I think we have this again with AI tools, and I can relate completely. I think that huge amounts of our cognitive, and it's the laziness. It's like, oh, I could try and think about this, go to market strategy, but why don't I just ask ChatGPT, etc.
Right.
And that becomes such a and the results you get back are very convincing, and you actually, in order to be able to see the flaws, you actually have to do the work, because it can like render anything in a very convincing, okay, well, this breaks down into four parts, bang bang bang. um and so I'm extremely concerned, actually,
Yeah.
about the long-term impacts basically on cognition
Right.
of kind of this form of outsourcing. But I also believe that, like, if we can design the right tools, AI can be just like a magnificent expansion of the human mind, like a kind of a telescope for thought. I've recently had some experiences of that where, rather than thinking just being easier, faster, less effortful, I've had moments where I was trying to kind of complete a thought on an intuitive thought about a subject matter I don't know very well,
Right.
and then being able to say, um, if this thought is true, what would also need to be true? And
Mm,
then it becomes like an extension and like a way of inhabiting, going down pathways of thought faster, saving you the need to do 2 weeks of research to be able to even formulate the thought. And then you see this kind of the beginnings of what I think is genuinely mind expanding.
right. And then in terms of optimizing the brain, is there a distinction between just memorizing something and having like rule of first principles thinking logic? Like in terms of optimizing actually understanding something fundamentally, are those two different things of memory and a rule of first principles thinking?
So I've just done a podcast. I'm trying to enter the
Yeah.
room. So yeah, so the question is like, where does memorization fit in the mind? And here I have a bit of a I'm not sure if it's an original perspective, but it goes against the countervailing model of the mind, where I believe memory is central to thought and to language and to imagination. And so I see it as actually, at some level, the core cognitive capability, or at least fundamentally intertwined with everything else we do in our minds. The classical model of memory typically says, okay, you get perception, that's informational input, you process it, you form like a picture of the world. That picture goes into memory if you need to, or gets matched up with memory. And then we form intentions, and then we act.
Mhm,
That's the typical view of the mind. It's kind of box and arrow thing. But what you see is that if you learn things, you
mhm,
perceive them differently.
mhm,
So, for example, if you like learn the name of a species of bird or
mhm,
something,
mhm.
you'll then recognize that bird in the world. If you know a new word, you'll hear that word in the world. Or if you learn a new language, the people who speak it will seem to be speaking less quickly. You'll
Right.
have, because memory is intertwined with our perception, and it's also like thoroughly connected with imagination. And one way of thinking about it is that, like, imagination is memory for the future, and remembering is memory for the past. Because in both cases, we're conjuring. In both cases, we're imagining. In both
Right.
cases, we're kind of cognitively recreating the kind of state which would have been present were we to experience at the time. So going back to your kind of your question, I think that knowledge is and memory is foundational to thinking and understanding. And I think that's often forgotten and it's not often evident to experience. So you can actually kind of have the illusion that you understand something when you like read a brief thing about it.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and you're very, reading is very kind of compelling like that. You read it and you're like, oh yeah, I'm really kind of understanding what's happening here. Like actual understanding is this sort of this deep mnemonic interconnection of the world with your model of the world, with your memories. And so, relating that to optimization, I think memory can be itself, the process of remembering things can be incredibly optimized, but you can't optimize away the need to remember stuff.
Right. Right. Yeah, because I've seen that in my own life that sometimes I'll read something and it may be fresh in my mind and I think I fully understand it, but then a couple months will pass and I truly didn't there was something that was missing in that logic that didn't made me actually hold that knowledge, for a longer
Yeah,
period
there's
of
a very
time.
useful, concept in this, which is the difference between like productive and recognition memory.
Mhm.
So, in order to be able to recognize someone's face, you can have seen them once 5 years ago, but in order to be able to imagine it or like call to mind who that person is and remember things about them, that productive capacity, where you go, "Oh, Alan, how are you?" Um, it's a different level. And if you think about, it's a bit like the difference between a multiple choice question. Which of these is the correct answer? It's
Mm,
quite easy. You're like, that one, right? Even if it's
right,
only a fragment of knowledge in your mind. Whereas to say, explain this to a person is a whole different activity, right? It requires a much greater
100%.
depth.
Mhm.
And this is, by the way, one of the reasons I recommend to people to always explain any book they've read to a friend,
Okay.
because just the process of doing that helps you recognize what you haven't noticed or understood.
I've seen that for sure in my own life as well. Like, I studied finance, and the best way that I've learned was actually teaching it to individuals that didn't know anything about investing, and then I started to figure out, okay, like, I actually didn't fully understand this piece that I thought I
Mhm.
knew so well. So now, Ed, going to one of these tactics I wrote down, when I was doing research, you talk about this thing called memory palaces, method of Lucy. What exactly is this?
So the method of loci, which
Okay.
means places in Latin, so the memory palace is essentially using the strongest aspect of our kind of natural mammalian cognition,
Mhm.
which is basically kind of spatial navigation and memory. Something which for hundreds of millions of years creatures have been embedding deep into their brains through evolution, whereas language is whatever, a couple 100,000 years old, something like that. um, so it's a much more fundamental mental capability, and we humans are unbelievably good at imagining spaces and remembering them. And it turns out that spaces have very natural sequence to them. If I kind of begin in this office, go outside, turn left, go up the path, go into the other building, and so on, even if I've only experienced that route 2 or 3 times, I'll be able to kind of recall it in memory very quickly. So what the memory palace is it uses that capability, and instead of like just going through the path in your imagination, each step along it, you store images of what you want to remember.
Okay.
And that's as simple as like, if we look at the bookshelf behind me, I
Mhm.
might say, okay, I'm going to imagine Einstein. It's interesting. I'm not very good at coordinating my hand looking backwards, but yeah, we could imagine Einstein on top of there, you know, whatever, like holding a spoon. It's very easy to form that image, and if I've imagined that there, and then here, on top of my laptop, you can see it here.
Mhm.
I imagine whatever, the Pope playing the violin. There's no way having formed those images that you get confused about which one's in which place. And it turns out that you can actually form these images. It's kind of a miracle of human cognition, about one per second.
Mhm.
So, and they can stick. So I can have like a list of 100 objects or whatever, and in a couple of minutes I can go through them. Just be imagine, okay, we already know Einstein's up there and the Pope is here, and then there's a lemon there, and there's this, a tumble dryer there, and a tractor over there. I can form these images, and when I go back to that space in my imagination, those images will pop into my mind as quick, as if they were stored there just a second ago. And what this allows is for you to learn incredibly long sequences of, for example, numbers or images or objects simply by placing images of them around a memory palace.
Right. And so what would be your rebuttal? Because I know there's a lot of individuals that they push back on, let's say, retaining information because they say, "Oh, well, I have Google, I have ChatGPT." Using these concepts, what is your rebuttal for someone that says this is not like important for someone to actually build that skill of memory and retaining information? What will be your rebuttal?
Well, first, I'm not sure how important memory palaces really are. They are a very powerful methodology for learning long sequences of information. I think that to the general question,
Yeah.
why is it worth knowing things? Is that like knowing things it's what I said before actually. Things is deeply connected to thinking them and imagining them and perceiving them. And so if you don't know any distinctions between birds, your world is just going to contain the generic category bird, and none of the individual specifics of them are actually going to form in your mind. You're not even going to really notice them. Um, and the same thing goes with like concepts. If you haven't studied logical fallacies, there'll be all kinds of unreason which are invisible to you. If you can't, and so so my rebuttal is to the idea of the value of not knowing things is that you're not just losing the information, you're losing the ability to think around it, you're losing the ability to see it, you're losing the ability to understand it. Uh, and that is, I think, the essence of having a rich consciousness.
So it's almost like if you don't utilize that skill, you stay within like this black box of your own reality where maybe you can't escape
Yeah,
it. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's very much a case of if all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. Yeah.
No, no, I
But I think
agree.
there's something else, which is that I think that the experience of delegating your cognition to tools is a boring one. And there's a great MIT study lately, Your Brain on ChatGPT, I think it was called, where they basically looked at people who wrote essays with or without the help of Google and ChatGPT. And effectively, they found that in the students who'd used ChatGPT, not only were the essays of lower quality in the end, because they were just generic, and not only was there much less brain activation, they had like a sort of EEG scanner, so basically people were using their brains much less, but people felt less ownership, less satisfaction, less interest in what they were doing. So that's quite critical too. In order to truly, in order to enjoy life, you've got to be a participant. And nobody would say you can outsource your birthday or your favorite memories or your friends. Like, I used to have friends, but now I got like a bot which tells me what my friend would have said. Nobody would imagine that that's a fun way to live life. And I think
Right.
something similar goes for not knowing things.
And how do you cultivate that space in your own life today with all the technology, with social media, with AI to critically think? Do you set like blocks of time to just like be in a room locked and just write? Like, how do you kind of go about it today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always very happy when I do find a block of time to just write. Often I need to just turn off the internet.
Right.
Um, Sometimes I go into a wood with my laptop. Laptops have quite long batteries these days. So you can just go into a wood,
Uh-huh.
find a log, and say, "Okay, I'm coming out in 3 hours." And then, of course, you lose track of time. You go deep into the ideas and so on. I think, it's interesting. It ties in a bit to MindMax, this company I've recently founded, which is really an attempt to answer the question: how can we like amplify human genius in the age of AI? Because there's a paradox involved, which is that our tools now put knowledge and intelligently marshaled knowledge at our fingertips on any topic. You can name something arbitrarily obscure, whatever, cutlery manufacturer in Costa Rica,
Mhm.
and then and a system can give you the kind of the wisdom of a local expert on that topic like that. And at the same time, I think for most people, the feeling is that our thoughts are becoming more superficial, that we have this, and the social media environment is very tough because, for example, on TikTok, it establishes a cognitive pattern of attention
Mhm.
that reinforces that, dopamine loop
Right.
where you almost to begin to read a sentence in a book feels achingly long. You're like, oh, come on, get on with it. Why is there not like stuff being thrown at me? But yeah, so I mean, I think this is the big question. In my personal life, I always think the company of conversation with friends is probably one of my favorite activities because, you actually get some of the entertainment, but you get also the depth and unpredictability of actual human discourse and the thorough exploration of ideas. But what we're doing with Mind Max is kind of interesting. So the intention is to, nurture human genius at a grand scale and really like try and build an educational platform, but it may look a bit different from that, where someone who comes in and becomes a frequent user will become materially more knowledgeable, will expand their capabilities of thinking, and will discover their gifts and hopefully feel some kind of transformational effect on their capabilities in the world. And what we've chosen to do is make it like an audio first experience. So it's like a kind of an audio voice experience. And the reason we did that is that it's the one time when your mind is not under attack. On your phone, if you're kind of using an app or something, there's always the possibility that like something will come in, you'll be reminded of something, you'll
Right.
just quickly go check something, but then the notification's different, so you go check that, and then you completely forget why you were there, and then you get sucked down a rabbit hole. It's a very like angry, confusing cognitive environment. But sound is so spacious. Even just the difference between hearing a sentence and reading it. If you read a sentence, the momentum of the visual means that I think you're less likely to have neighboring thoughts. But if you listen to an experience, your mind's a bit freer to kind of expand, to go into different directions, to think, oh, is that really true? Or like, this reminds me of a thing. So that's the first decision we made. Second is that it's kind of conversational, that it both, you can ask a question any time and it will prompt you to answer questions continuously. So it's like having a kind of a conversational partner mediated by AI. And then we're also in the system remembering everything you've learned before and reminding of it as you're learning new things. So, if you're sort of saying, oh, I'm learning about some aspect of brain chemistry, it will know all the other aspects of brain chemistry you studied. And then we'll say, well, this is a bit like what you studied before, but actually it works with the different mechanisms. The explanation will be based on your level of knowledge. Finally, we've kind of, one of my beliefs is that there's no such thing as a general intelligence.
Okay.
I think every mind is a specific perspective on the world, which is created from its own goals and interests and proclivities and so on. And so, for example, when you read Nietzsche versus Alain de Botton versus Jeff Dyer, what each of these writers carries a different perspective on the world. It's not like you could turn up the intelligence setting on Nietzsche and then turn up the intelligence setting on Jeff Dyer and they become the same thing. That they're both, you know, they're both lacking variance of some general perfect intelligence like an AI. No, all thinking is from a perspective. And so we've kind of created a faculty of AI intellect, if you like, bots basically, but based on historic characters, but you can make new ones and you can clone yourself or whatever, with the view that the best form of learning happens in conversation with another finite mind.
Okay, and then so you're saying conversation, you would say, is the number one way you feel individuals can enhance their memory due to the attention span that they could have in that conversation versus if they're learning through social media, they could constantly jump from thing to thing and they don't really get that time on
Yeah,
that
so
one.
that's one reason. So conversation is very spacious, but it's also
Right.
interactive, right? And it's high agency. You don't you don't just sit and listen to a conversation. You're in the conversation. You're and that makes all the difference because it's productive. Um, so in order to be in a conversation, you actually have to have thoughts. You have to articulate them, and it's off road, right? Because you might say, "Well, what I understood from this thing was that whatever. The best way to get jacked is to eat lots of protein at breakfast." And your friend might say, "Well, actually, it turns out that's what people used to think, but there's this new study which whatever." And so it's unpredictable, which is exactly as it should be. That all of your beliefs and knowledge should be provisional, able to be updated.
Yeah, that makes sense because if I kind of compare two scenarios, if I'm just reading a book, it's more so like a one-way street where I'm consuming the information, but versus a conversation like this, there's going to be genuine thoughts that I have, and I could just ask you on the spot, and then that kind of dives into other
Yeah,
different topics as well. Interesting.
yeah.
And the last thing that I want to ask you, Ed, and then we'll talk about what you're working on for social media, right? It distracts a lot of our focus. Do you think focus is the number one thing to achieve the mastery and the memory? or if you had like maybe a top 5 things where people can go ahead and tackle these to become like yourself.
Yeah, good question. So, top 5 things to enhance memory. The first I would say is it's very connected to focus, but it's not quite focus.
Mhm.
It's to have a kind of calm, receptive mindset. And so focus, and that when you're focused, it is calm, but focus almost kind of implies a goal orientedness. But I think having that disposition, I think, so that's one thing is being kind of calm and receptive. Second thing is use your imagination. So every memory is when you recall a memory, it's a recreation of something you experienced. So you have to make sure that what you experience is really interesting in the first place. And like parties and stuff where people forget names, 90% of the time because they didn't even really listen in the first place.
Right.
So like an enormous part of the art of memory is like paying attention,
Mhm.
but paying attention is an active process. You're not like, it's not just like not having distractions. I've got to be able to actually like pay attention to, okay, you call Gabriel. Okay, cool. But what does that mean to me is the other question. Like, how does that fit into, my own world? I had a colleague called Gabe, who's super cool. And I know this other guy and there's Angel Gabriel, or whatever it means to you, you
Right.
have to connect it to your existing memories. And so that's the third thing is that a new memory is always a connection to an existing memory. So you always have to actively make that bridge. Fourth thing is repetition. And repetition works at 100 different levels, but it's even powerful in the course of a conversation with someone over a 1 minute period to, for example, repeat their name out loud, to actively record it. There, by the way, when you're doing that, the memory isn't just a thing inside your head; it becomes a skill of saying it out loud. It becomes continued. So that's the thing. And the fifth thing, it probably is the memory palace. But I'll give an interesting example, which is that when I'm organizing parties, I always make sure that there are many different spaces in the party, and I try and make the party go on a kind of journey through these spaces. And the reason for that is that you can have an amazing party just chatting to 4 people in a kitchen. But the thing is, at the end of the party, you don't really remember what you spoke about because all of those memories are on top of each other. They're layered on top of each other, and therefore
Right.
they interfere, and therefore they're difficult to pick out, so you can't recall them. So but whereas if you have there's a memory palace basically in the world, but if I do something here and then we have another adventure over there, and then we climb up a tree over here, and then there's some champagne over there and whatever, you can recall the separate memories in separate places. So that's the final thing I say for memory is like move. Both actually in your life, go to different places. If you're going on dates, the same things works, by the way. It builds trust much faster to have experiences with people in several locations. And to my mind, that would complete the 5 top tips for enhancing memory.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like for myself, it was always hard to kind of define how can I get better at this thing because I can't like physically see it. More so,
Mhm.
like if you want to get bigger biceps or get a 6 pack, I guess you could kind of physically see the progress. But I think memory is something that's a little bit more nuanced.
Mhm.
So Ed, talk
Although,
about a
yeah,
little.
having said that, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
I actually think there's something profound in what you say, which is that because it's inside the head, it's mysterious a bit.
right.
But of course, you can actually um, you can actually just go memorize a poem, and then you know that you memorize a poem because you can chat it to someone over a campfire, you know. And so I do encourage, in order to train memory, just to actually learn things and learn things you want to know. And poems are a great start because they're socially useful.
Amazing. And Ed, currently, with your company, to my understanding, you are training individuals how to learn languages. Can you tap into that a little bit?
Well, yeah. So my first company is called Memrise.
Uh-huh.
And so that's a language learning app which integrates memory techniques into the language learning and has I don't know 80 million users or something in total, and that's a great way to learn a language. It's got repetition and testing built in with lots of fun videos of native speakers in context. But I actually have a new project dating back about a year,
Let's go.
which I'm super excited about and which I've hardly talked about in public, so consider this to be a scoop. But yeah, it's called MindMax, and yeah, the vision of MindMax is to amplify human genius in the age of AI. And yeah, we have built a mobile app which you can download today in the US and UK, MindMax, which allows you basically to have these interactive conversations with historical figures. You could put in a learning goal, say, "Oh, I want to thoroughly understand how bispecific antibodies work or something like this.
Right.
And then it'll say, okay, and it'll ask you a bunch of questions about why and how deeply and for what purpose. And then it'll create like a syllabus for you. And then that syllabus will be made up of kind of conversations and quizzes and the rest of it. And so it kind of allows you to sort of take control of your learning and basically learn whatever you want with a kind of AI coach vibe.
Okay, so you set the objective and then it breaks you down through a series of questions to see where your logic is missing and things of that sort?
Yeah, so I mean, less at the kind of local level, but yeah, so it's sort of it is. I think that one of the most important things with learning is like, why are you learning it? Like, well,
Right.
you sort of if you say, oh, I want to learn philosophy, that actually could mean a million different things. Okay, do you want to learn about moral philosophy? Is this to sharpen your logic? Is it to understand the history? Is it to follow a particular thinker? Right, and the same thing's true of everything. If I want to know, even like something which sounds very specific, like kinetic engineering. Okay, do you want to build a moving bridge or a children's swing or a
Right.
Formula One car, or all of these will have different paths, different necessary knowledges, different. So that's what it does. It kind of understands why and what you want to learn, creates a syllabus, and then that syllabus is a bunch of lessons and conversations which adapt to you in real time. And you have your kind of a coach and you check in. He's like, oh, how's it going today, Ed? And I'm like, oh, pretty good. It's like, still feel like doing some quantum physics? And I'm like, not really. I was like, okay, cool. Well, let's talk about this. You know,
Right.
so
Well, I'll leave you off with this last question I have for you, Ed. What is your best memory ever?
I actually do know. I do actually have an answer to this. So it was on a beach in Greece, and I used to run. I used to create for my friends this holiday every year called Thinking Garden, which is like a 2 week philosophical commune. And I invite all the most interesting people I knew to spend 2 weeks with the internet turned off, kind of slightly in a kind of in a jokey way, like Greek philosophers, you know, there's some mild robes going on sometimes. And in the middle of one of these, with this crazily cool group of friends, we had this day which had been like a bit of a grey day, but we'd had this amazing adventure with the words and philosophical discussions and playing guitar and so on. And we wound up on this like basically completely private beach, as it turned out. This kind of beach, no one else there. And then the sun came out, and someone put some headphones on my ears, playing like this heavenly album by Mysterium. And somehow the elation of the moment as I kind of looked around deep in the bosom of this 2 week philosophical commune, and I saw my crazy Stanford professor friend and my friend Gaia, who's a sort of amazingly beautiful poet. Blah, blah, and all my other friends. Blah, blah, blah. It was a sort of sense of completeness, as if to say, this is what life should be about. And yeah, that's probably my favorite memory.
That is absolutely legendary. Ed Cook, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time,
Hey, my
and
pleasure.
thank you again.
Thank you
Cheers.
so much. All right, ciao.